Hello, welcome to the Mad Batter channel. My name's Chris. If you find this video interesting and or useful, perhaps you'll consider giving it a like and possibly subscribing to the channel, which will be a great help. Many thanks. In the latest update to Luminar Neo, they introduced the long-awaited clone tool. So let's talk about this. You'll find the clone tool under the professional down here at the bottom, and it's fairly simple with adjustments for size, softness and strength of the cloning brush. But first we need to put this into context. It's a close relative of the erase tool, which is in fact misnamed. It's not an erase tool at all. An erase tool deletes all the pixels, leaving transparency below it. I can demonstrate that here in Photoshop with the erase tool. If I then start brushing over, you'll see it leaves behind this checkerboard pattern which indicates transparency, i.e. there are no pixels at all in this area. In fact, the erase tool acts just like the spot healing brush tool in Photoshop. So if I take the spot healing brush, there are various options up here, but for the moment we'll just go with things as they are. If I go over that mark there, you see it removes the mark, but it doesn't leave transparency. It leaves new pixels which the program itself has decided upon. Similarly with this dark cloud here, that's gone, it's been replaced by similar pixels again chosen by the software. So back here in Luminar, let's go to the erase tool. Now make the brush a bit bigger and let's have a look at this cloud here. If we just brush over it and then click erase, you'll see it's got rid of that cloud. But it was the program that decided what pixels to put in place of where we'd brushed. So I like to look upon the erase tool as an automated healing brush or automated clone stamp tool. Whereas the clone stamp tool is a manual one in the sense that you as the user decide what pixels are to be used to replace the ones you want to remove. Now the erase tool is very good at removing objects surrounded by uniform type pixels, but in more complex situations it often doesn't get the replacement right. So let's have a look at this bird here and its shadow. Click erase and see what we get. Now, it's done okay, but it's made a bit of mess of this shadow here, but otherwise that's not too bad. So let's undo that and go down to the clone stamp tool, and you normally want high softness to avoid getting any nasty lines or edges. The strength will be 100% and the size depends on what we're doing. So you click Alt to select your source point, so we'll click here, Alt and click, and then I'll make the brush slightly bigger, then we'll start painting and you'll see it replaces the pixels that we've chosen, not what the program's chosen. It's important to keep sampling in different areas to avoid repeating patterns. And then for here we click on the edge of the shadow and then try and align it up and then go down like that. So I would say that's done a much better job than the erase tool did. So let's undo that and go down to the clone stamp tool, and you normally want high softness to avoid getting any nasty lines or edges. The strength will be 100% and the size depends on what we're doing. So you click Alt to select your source point, so we'll click here, Alt and click, and then I'll make the brush slightly bigger, then we'll start painting and you'll see it replaces the pixels that we've chosen, not what the program's chosen. It's important to keep sampling in different areas to avoid repeating patterns. And then for here we click on the edge of the shadow and then try and align it up and then go down like that. So I would say that's done a much better job than the erase tool did. So let's undo that and go down to the clone stamp tool. And you normally want high softness to avoid getting any nasty lines or edges. The strength will be 100% and the size depends on what we're doing. So you click Alt to select your source point. So we'll click here, Alt and click, and then I'll make the brush slightly bigger. Then we'll start painting and you'll see it replaces the pixels that we've chosen, not what the program's chosen. It's important to keep sampling in different areas to avoid repeating patterns. And then for here we click on the edge of the shadow and then try and align it up and then go down like that. So I would say that's done a much better job than the erase tool did. So we'll undo that and go back to the clone stamp tool. Now, as I say, it's a pretty simple tool, adjusting size, softness and strength of the brush, but there are severe limitations. You can't clone from one layer to another in a document or between documents. You can't use blend modes, nor can you clone at different sizes or in perspective. It's very difficult to do that. Now that of itself doesn't make this a bad tool. If you're promoting Luminar Neo as primarily a photo editing program, then the tool is perfectly good to remove unwanted blemishes or small objects. But if you're promoting it as a graphics design program as well, where you want to do more complex cloning, then I think it definitely falls short. And to demonstrate that, we'll go into Photoshop and have a look at the clone stamp tool there. So here we are back in Photoshop with the same file, and I've chosen the clone stamp tool here by pressing S on the keyboard. You'll see this file has two layers. The top layer is the colour image and underneath is a black and white version. So I can actually clone from one layer to another. So if we click on the black and white layer, press Alt and click down here, then activate the top layer, you see I can clone the black and white from the lower layer up onto this layer. And then we can have blend mode. This was in normal mode. If I switch to multiply, you see I can still clone from that layer. With multiply blend mode, it gives a different effect. And I could then switch to screen, which has a different effect again. And of course I could go to one of the more exotic blend modes like difference. Produces a strange effect, but you can see this gives a great deal of flexibility. So this ability to clone between layers leads to a fundamental point about good practice, which is that you should always do your cloning on a new layer. So here we'll create a new layer, make sure that the clone tool is set to current and below, because it can't sample from its own layer because there's nothing there. We can then, we don't need to highlight the lower layer, we can just Alt click there and then I can do something like that, you see. So now the advantage of that is that as it's on its own layer, we can turn it off of course, we can change blend modes after the fact rather than while we're doing our actual cloning. So you can see we can change it. We can change the opacity, which has different effects. Normally when you're just getting rid of an object in a photograph, you wouldn't want other than 100%. But if you're doing things like skin retouching, then you may get rid of blemishes, dark marks under the eyes, but that looks a bit too drastic. So if it's on its own layer, you can then reduce the opacity to calm the effect and make it look more natural. One other thing you can do with the clone stamp tool in Photoshop is clone between different documents. So here I have a picture of some parsley from my back garden. So if I alt click on this and then go back to our document, I can now start cloning in that parsley in here, so we can put some nice green growth down the bottom here. That's an alternative to bring this other document over as a new layer and then masking it. Another reason to use a new layer is that if you have non-straight lines, when you clone them, they're not at the right angle or position. So let's say you want to get rid of this shadow on this tower of the Greek church. Create a new layer. We've got this clone stamp tool. So now we'll alt click here, come down here, so as you can see, obviously this is all at the wrong angle. But because we're on a new layer, we can transform and warp this cloned area. So Control T, free transform, and we can move it around. It still needs to come down a bit, and then click the warp button. And then we can warp that, take that up a little bit. Move it with the arrow keys, click OK. And there we have a nice line matching the upper part of the dome. So that's yet another advantage of cloning onto a new layer. There is actually another way to do this which might be simpler, and that's using something called the Clone Source panel. So if you go up to Window, Clone Source, here you'll find a whole load of other options. Across the top, these 5 boxes allow you to choose different cloning points which you can keep going back to. So for this first one, if I alt click there, then I can start cloning there. If I now go here, I can choose, let's say, this one, and then I can start cloning that. But now if I go back to this one, I can start cloning further from there. Go back to this one, start cloning further from there. So if we get rid of those, if we click off aligned, I go back here, I start cloning there, revert to this one, start cloning there. If I go back to this one, it'll start from the same position, and again here. So you might find that useful. Yeah, well, get rid of these. And down the bottom is the overlay. Now you can see, if I make the brush a bit bigger, you can see a preview of what you're going to clone. Some think this is useful, some don't. If you tick that, then you can't see, although it'll still clone the same way. Put that back on. If you unclick clipped, then it shows the whole, although it's cloning here, it shows the whole area, and that's probably not very useful at all. Perhaps of more interest are these features up here. So if I alt click here and start cloning, if I click that, it reverses. Do you see? It does it backwards. If I alt click, let's say here, click that, and it's doing it backwards. We'll get rid of these. Similarly with this button, let's turn that off. I'll click here. But if I click this button, it's now doing it upside down. And for something in between, you can use this angle. So again, we clone normally. Now if I change that angle and start cloning, you see it's rotated. So this is what I meant by maybe an easy way of doing this top dome. If I alt click here, obviously I can't, there's no point in doing that, but if I rotate this large negative, you see it roughly matches, so I can just clone from the other side. I know the colour isn't the same, so that way I can use this edge to clone this side of the dome. Finally, the other useful feature is a scaling feature. So if I click and do that, but now I can change the size. So let's go for 60%. Is that much smaller? Or I can go the other way and it's that much bigger. You can obviously undo the link and then it's now much thinner but taller than the original. So again, you might find that useful on some rare occasions. Before we move on, I should also say, of course, that you can use the full panoply of Photoshop brushes while you're cloning. Most of the time you'll use a standard soft round brush, but you don't have to. So for instance, if I alt click here, it's a standard brush. I can go in, click on the brush panel, for instance, have it scatter like that. So now when you see, it produces a scattering pattern. Get rid of that. You can go in and choose any sort of brush that you want. Let's try, I don't know, a starburst brush. Make it smaller. And there we go. So there are literally thousands of brushes in Photoshop, and of course for any particular brush you can change its shape or its dynamics or whatever you want. So the possibilities are endless, although again you're unlikely to use most of these things most of the time, but they're there if you need them. The other important thing you could do in Photoshop is use its wide range of selection tools to limit the area the clone stamp works in. So if we go back to this image we used in Luminar Neo before, zoom in, and we want to get rid of this green waste bin. Now, if you're going to use the clone stamp tool, it'll be quite difficult to clone around the edge of this tree trunk here. So what we need to do is to select this green bin to limit the area the clone stamp tool works. Now the best way here, because there's some dark bits of the bin as well as on the tree trunk, is first of all to get the area onto its own layer. So we select the rectangular marquee tool and select it all, press Ctrl and J to put it onto its own layer, hide the background. And now I want to brighten this up to try and make the difference between the bin and the tree trunk more marked. And the best way to do that is Image Adjustments, Curves, and we'll push up the curve like that. So that makes it more obvious where the edge is. Click OK. And now the best way to select this edge is select colour range, and we'll hit this green, we'll select this slightly fuzzier green. I think we're OK. Increase the fuzziness to get a bit more, click OK. So now we can hide that there, we don't need it anymore. Go back here, and to see what we've selected, as I showed in one of my previous videos, press the Q key and you'll see we've got a reasonably good edge around the tree. So get out of that, delete that layer, we don't need it, get a new layer, select the clone stamp tool, current and below, and now if I click, say, here, we can start cloning, knowing that we're not going to clone out any of the tree. Need to keep changing the selection point. There we are. Press Control and D to get rid of it. So now we've got a selection around the edge of the tree, and then we can proceed to clone out all the other bits that we don't want. I won't do it here, but you see the point. And you can do the rest to taste. So that shows you how the selection can get you a good edge around a difficult area without having to go and try and draw around it. There's one last element to cloning in Photoshop which I want to show, and that's cloning in perspective. So we've got this tower here which is getting smaller as you get further away into the image. So I'll create two new layers. On the first one we'll just try cloning in the normal way. So we'll alt-click here and then line it up, and you'll see it just doesn't work because the image is too big, it's making it the same size. So we'll now go into what's called the vanishing point filter, in which is embedded a separate cloning tool. So we go Filter, Vanishing Point. Now we've got to create a plane, so we've got the Plane tool. There's our plane, we extend it up into the sky, and now we go to the Clone Stamp tool, or click somewhere, and then we'll start cloning. Now you see it's in perfect perspective. So that's yet another facility in Photoshop which obviously doesn't exist in Luminar Neo. So here we are back in Luminar Neo, and our nice and simple clone stamp tool down here. Now, as I said before, if you just want to remove some objects, small objects or blemishes from a photo, that's fine. But if you want to do more complex things and graphics design, then this clone tool certainly isn't adequate. But I have come up with a number of techniques to mimic some of the extra functionality you find in the Photoshop clone stamp tool. I fear, however, that this video has already got far too long, and so I'll produce a separate video on that in the next few days. In the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed it, it's been useful, and thanks for watching.